The morning light poured through the tall, spotless windows of St. Charles Medical Pavilion, a private clinic so pristine it practically hummed with wealth and silent hierarchies. Marble floors gleamed beneath Amara Lewis's soft steps as she entered the reception area. At 8 months pregnant, her belly rounded gracefully beneath a pale blue maternity dress, and her locks were pulled into a neat bun. The name stitched into her handbag was discreet, but notable: Lewis. She felt the gaze of those around her, curious, assessing, some indifferent, a few openly dismissive. Amara had grown accustomed to this kind of tension. At 32, she was an accomplished cultural historian, an author, a woman fluent in 4 languages, and yet in spaces like this, wealthy, white, clinical, all that ever seemed to matter was her skin. She adjusted the slim bracelet on her wrist, a gift from Elijah on their anniversary, and took a deep breath. This was her 3rd prenatal appointment here, and she was already counting down the days until she could deliver at the birthing center she and Elijah had selected, a black-led, community-centered facility across town. "Mrs. Lewis?" the nurse called, clipboard in hand. Amara stood, offering a polite smile, and followed the nurse down a sterile corridor. The room they entered was cold, aggressively so, and smelled faintly of antiseptic. Framed photos of smiling white families lined the walls. She climbed onto the examination table, the thin paper crinkling beneath her. "Dr. Randall will be in shortly," the nurse said curtly, not meeting Amara's eyes before leaving. Amara sighed and glanced at the monitor displaying her name, the time, and the purpose of her visit. Routine prenatal checkup. 32 weeks. The door swung open without a knock. In stepped Dr. Mitchell Randall, a man in his mid-50s with silvering hair, pressed navy scrubs, and the air of someone deeply convinced of his own importance. He didn't greet her. Instead, he scanned her chart and muttered something under his breath. Amara braced herself. "So," he began, peering over his glasses. "Ms. Lewis." He made a point of hesitating at her name. "How are we today?" Amara ignored the condescension in his voice. "Feeling well, thank you." No unusual discomfort. He grunted, jotting something down. Then, without looking at her, he asked, "And the father, still in the picture?" Amara's stomach twisted. She stared at him. "Yes, he's my husband." A smirk played at the corner of his mouth. "Of course, and he's working?" Amara's voice sharpened slightly. "Yes, he's a lawyer." Randall made a noise that wasn't quite a laugh. "That's so? Good for him." Hard to come by these days. The words hung heavy in the room, a thinly veiled insult everyone present could feel. A nurse, a young woman with tight blonde curls, stood against the wall pretending to be engrossed in a chart. She didn't intervene. Randall moved toward Amara, placing the cold stethoscope against her belly without warning. The baby kicked, and Amara winced. "You people," Randall muttered low enough for Amara to catch it, "always have big babies." For a split second, Amara froze. Her heart pounded, the room shrinking around her. The words weren't new. She'd heard them in variations her whole life, in classrooms, at book signings, in grocery stores. But somehow, hearing them now, directed at her unborn child, made them hit like a physical blow. "I'm sorry, what did you say?" she asked, her voice trembling not from fear but from controlled fury. Randall smiled like a man who believed himself untouchable. "I said, statistically speaking, African-American babies tend to be larger. We'll have to keep an eye on that, don't want any surprises." Amara sat up. "I want another doctor." Randall chuckled. "We're fully booked today, Mrs. Lewis. Best you calm down and let's get this over with." "Don't make a scene." At that, a woman waiting just outside the open door, another patient, visibly pregnant and white, glanced into the room, her eyes wide and uneasy. 2 nurses exchanged glances but said nothing. Amara's hand moved instinctively to her phone. She didn't have to think twice. She sent a single text to Elijah. "At clinic. Problem. Now." She slid off the table, standing firm. "We're done here," she said quietly. You walk out now. I'll note it as a refusal of care, Randall threatened. Amara met his gaze, her voice calm and clear. You do whatever you need to do. I know exactly who to call. Without another word, she picked up her bag and walked out into the hallway, the ripple of silence following her like a shadow. The receptionist, whose cheerfulness had evaporated, offered a stiff smile. Amara ignored it. She stepped out into the courtyard garden outside the clinic's glass doors, sat on a bench beneath a blooming magnolia tree, and waited. She checked her watch. 13 minutes, 12, 11. At minute 7, the staff inside began to buzz. Phones rang, texts flew. A security guard who hadn't moved from his post all morning suddenly straightened as a sleek black SUV pulled into the roundabout. The driver stepped out, opened the door, and out came Elijah Lewis. In a tailored dark suit 6'3", with broad shoulders and a presence that made people part like water, Elijah strode toward the clinic with purpose. His face was unreadable, but his eyes, sharp, focused, made the receptionist visibly pale. The security guard averted his gaze. 15 minutes had passed, and everything inside those walls was about to change. If this story of injustice and transformation moved you, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more stories that turn pain into power. Inside St. Charles Medical Pavilion, tension rippled through the air like static before a storm. Nurses whispered behind computer stations, peeking out from behind monitors, as Elijah Lewis crossed the marble floor with measured, silent fury. The clack of his leather soles echoed louder than the ambient classical music, louder than the hum of printers and muffled conversations. Every head turned, every pair of eyes tracked him. Elijah Lewis wasn't just a man with presence. He was a man whose name sat atop donor plaques in hospitals, libraries, and civic centers. He was the kind of man administrators scrambled to accommodate, whose phone calls got returned in minutes, whose presence in a room made hierarchies rearrange themselves. And in that moment, no one inside the clinic could pretend they didn't know exactly who he was. The receptionist, a young woman named Paige who had laughed at Randall's comment minutes earlier, fumbled her mouse and nearly knocked over a bottle of hand sanitizer. She pasted on a brittle smile as Elijah approached. "Good afternoon, sir. Do you have an appointment?" "I'm here for Amara Lewis," Elijah said, voice low, composed, but charged with an undercurrent of something lethal. She was scheduled for a 10:30 prenatal exam with Dr. Mitchell Randall. Paige swallowed. Yes, she's... Get the administrator," Elijah cut in, his eyes never leaving hers. "Now." A bead of sweat slid down the receptionist's temple as she picked up the phone, her voice unsteady as she made the call. "Mr. Lewis is here. He's asking for Mr. Hawthorne immediately." Across the waiting area, other patients, most of them white, dressed in upscale athleisure and tailored suits, watched the scene unfold, some with idle curiosity, others with the smugness of those used to seeing people like Amara put in their place. A few glanced at their phones, already aware that something unusual was happening. Inside a staff break room down the hall, 2 nurses whispered over their coffee mugs. "That's the woman Randall went off on," one murmured. "I heard him," the other admitted, voice low. "The things he said. If that was my sister. But we can't get involved. We should." They didn't move. Back in the reception area, the elevator dinged, and a slender man in a charcoal gray suit emerged. Nathan Hawthorne, the hospital administrator, prided himself on his ability to defuse any crisis before it reached litigation. But the moment he saw Elijah Lewis standing in his lobby, his confidence cracked. Hawthorne knew this man, not just as a name on donation records, but as the senior partner of Lewis and Gray, a law firm responsible for dismantling half a dozen medical institutions over civil rights infractions in the past decade. He cleared his throat, pasted on a conciliatory expression. "Mr. Lewis, what an unexpected pleasure." "Save it," Elijah replied flatly. "Where's my wife?" She stepped outside," Hawthorne stammered, gesturing toward the courtyard. "Is everything... Where's Randall?" Hawthorne hesitated. He's with a patient. Not anymore. The administrator signaled a nurse behind the counter. Page Dr. Randall to conference room B, immediately. As the message crackled through the intercom system, a hush fell over the clinic. Phones stopped ringing. Conversations died mid-sentence. Even the relentless tapping of keyboards paused. The staff sensed what was coming, and none of them wanted to be anywhere near the blast radius. Amara re-entered the building at that moment, and her eyes locked on Elijah's. She crossed to him, taking his hand in hers, and though she spoke no words, the look she gave him told him everything he needed to know. "I'm fine," she murmured softly, but Elijah knew she wasn't. Randall appeared 5 minutes later, his face still smug until he registered who awaited him. "Oh," he chuckled awkwardly. "This must be the husband." The condescension in his voice was a practiced weapon, designed to belittle and reclaim dominance. But Elijah Lewis was not a man who could be dismissed, and certainly not in front of the woman he loved. Elijah's expression never changed. "Conference room." Now. Hawthorne gestured toward a glass-walled room adjacent to the waiting area, already emptied of its occupants. Randall entered, still carrying his clipboard, a nurse trailing uneasily behind. Elijah, Amara, and Hawthorne followed. The door closed, but the clinic's architecture betrayed them. The glass walls, meant to showcase transparency, now turned the confrontation into an inadvertent theater. The waiting room watched. Randall leaned back in a chair, making a show of crossing his legs. "Listen," he began, his tone oily. "If you're here to complain, I can assure you we followed every—" "Shut your mouth," Elijah said quietly, and it landed like a thunderclap. The nurse at Randall's side flinched. Elijah placed a sleek black folder on the table, opened it, and slid a document toward Hawthorne. "This is a notice of legal inquiry into discriminatory practices at St. Charles Medical Pavilion, specifically under the supervision of Dr. Mitchell Randall." Hawthorne paled. "Now wait a minute." Elijah cut him off with a glance. "Your employee verbally assaulted my wife. He made racially charged, medically inappropriate remarks about our child. He threatened her with refusal of care. And every second you don't act is another liability for this institution." Randall scoffed. "Oh, come on. This is ridiculous. It's her word against mine." Elijah smiled. Not a warm smile, not a forgiving one. "Is it?" He turned to Amara, who withdrew her phone and played a recording. Randall's voice filled the room. "You people always have big babies." Followed by his snide warning about making a scene. The blood drained from Hawthorne's face. In the hallway beyond, staff pretended to look busy while stealing glances into the glass room. A receptionist bit her lip. The nurse from earlier let out a quiet, "Good," under her breath. Randall's bluster collapsed into anger. "You can't record me without permission." Elijah leaned forward, voice low and lethal. "This is New York State, single-party consent. And guess what? She's the party." He turned to Hawthorne. "I suggest you decide, right now, whether this hospital's future is tied to this man. Because I promise you, in 15 minutes I can have every civil rights attorney in this city lined up outside your door, and the press with them." The administrator swallowed hard, his hands trembling. I'll need to make some calls." "You have 5 minutes," Elijah said, standing. "Then I'll start mine." In the waiting area, the silence was absolute. The reckoning had arrived. The clock on the wall ticked its relentless rhythm, each second pulling the staff and patients of St. Charles Medical Pavilion deeper into an eerie hush. What had begun as another day of routine checkups and quiet microaggressions had turned into something no one in that building could quite name, though every person in the waiting area felt it like static in the air. Amara sat beside Elijah in the conference room, her hand resting atop her belly. The baby stirred beneath her palm, as if sensing the crackling tension in the room. Through the glass walls, eyes flickered their way. Nurses pretending to check monitors, receptionists glancing over stacks of paperwork, patients shifting in chairs. Outside, The sleek black SUV remained stationed at the curb, its presence alone a signal. Few people knew the weight carried by that vehicle's insignia, but those who did felt it in their bones. Randall had paced to the far end of the room, muttering, furious, his face blotched and slick with sweat. Hawthorne was on his phone, speaking in rapid, clipped tones, his gaze darting between Elijah and the folder still splayed open on the table. The nurse, the one who had witnessed it all, lingered near the door. Her name tag read, Clara. Her eyes flicked to Amara's, then quickly away. Minutes crawled by. At the 7-minute mark, another SUV pulled up out front, this one bearing the seal of the Board of Medical Ethics. At 8 minutes, the director of the hospital, a tall, pinched man named Philip Morton, arrived in a rush, his face drawn tight, jacket half-buttoned. He didn't even stop at the desk. He made a beeline for the conference room. Elijah didn't rise when Morton entered. The hospital director barely spared a glance for Randall, instead focusing on Hawthorne. "What the hell is going on?" Morton hissed. Hawthorne's voice cracked. "Mr. Lewis has filed an inquiry." "We have a situation." Morton turned to Elijah, schooling his face into something resembling courtesy. "Mr. Lewis, I assure you, any misunderstanding—" "This wasn't a misunderstanding," Elijah said, standing. The power in his voice was not loud but absolute. "It was targeted, deliberate, and systemic." Amara spoke for the first time since sitting down. "He humiliated me, as a woman, as a black mother. He made assumptions about my husband, about my child, about my worth. And this isn't the first time he's done it, is it?" The room went still. Morton's jaw twitched. "Mrs. Lewis." Clara cleared her throat. Every head turned. I heard him," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "He's made comments like that before, about other patients too. Last year, there was a woman named Desiree Coleman. She came in for an exam and he refused to treat her because she was on Medicaid. Said she was probably having a baby just for the welfare check." The words hung like lead weights in the sterile air. Amara's stomach clenched. Elijah gave a sharp, almost imperceptible nod. "Thank you, Clara," Elijah said. "You've done the right thing." Morton's face darkened. "This is not the place." "Oh, but it is," Elijah countered, his voice low, his fury carefully harnessed. "Because this is the place it happened, and your entire staff heard it. Some laughed, some looked away. That ends today." At exactly the 15-minute mark, a third car arrived. Not another SUV this time, but a black sedan bearing the logo of the Sentinel, the city's largest media outlet. Out stepped a journalist, a tall, dark-skinned woman with cropped hair and a press badge around her neck. Janine Carter, one of Elijah's oldest friends. Morton blanched. "You leaked this?" he snapped. "I informed the public," Elijah said coolly. "About a public institution funded in part by taxpayer dollars discriminating against women of color." Janine raised her phone. "You can give a statement now, Director Morton, or you can read my front-page story tomorrow morning." Randall exploded. "This is absurd. You're destroying a man's career over—" "A pattern," Elijah cut in, his voice sharp enough to slice bone. "Over years of neglected care, coded language, and systemic prejudice." Behind him, another door opened. The chairman of the hospital board, a grizzled, white-haired man named Vernon Tate, appeared, flanked by 2 other board members. He'd been called when Elijah's legal notice landed on the board's secure server moments earlier. "Dr. Randall," Tate said coldly, "you're suspended immediately pending investigation." Randall's mouth opened, a protest forming, but no sound came. "Escort him out," Tate ordered. Security arrived at once, the same guard who had barely acknowledged Amara's presence that morning. Now he stood in front of Randall. "I suggest you don't cause a scene," Elijah advised. Randall's gaze swept the room, searching for an ally, finding none. Even Hawthorne looked away. As he was led out, the staff in the reception area watched in unguarded silence. Some stiffened, some looked relieved. A few nurses discreetly clapped. the sound barely audible but present. Janine Carter caught every second on her camera. Tate addressed the room. "Mr. Lewis, Mrs. Lewis, on behalf of the board, I offer my deepest apologies. This institution will conduct a thorough investigation. Effective immediately, we are reviewing our patient care protocols, staff conduct guidelines, and establishing a task force on medical bias." Elijah didn't smile. He didn't thank them. "Do better," he said, gathering Amara's hand in his. "And the name of that task force," Amara added, her voice steady, "should be the Desiree Coleman Initiative, in memory of every woman of color you dismissed, endangered, and discarded." Tate nodded. "It will be." They left without another word. As they stepped outside into the late morning sun, Amara's hand still cradling her belly, Elijah glanced at her. "You okay?" She managed a small, tired smile. "I am now." 15 minutes. That was all it took. 15 minutes to turn humiliation into reckoning. And it was only the beginning. The courtyard outside St. Charles Medical Pavilion shimmered under the late morning sun. A manicured row of dogwood trees framed the driveway as if pretending this place, with all its quiet corruption, was untouched by the grime of prejudice. But that veneer had already begun to crack, and its breaking point was now approaching. The moment Elijah Lewis stepped from the SUV, the tenor of the entire hospital changed. The guard at the front door, who had barely glanced at Amara when she arrived, straightened as though his spine were suddenly recalled to duty. A valet, mid-conversation with a wealthy patient about golf, stopped speaking mid-sentence. The receptionist's smile faltered at the corners. Elijah wasn't a celebrity in the traditional sense. His face didn't grace magazine covers. But to those who moved in the spheres of power, corporate boardrooms, judicial chambers, state houses, his name was both revered and quietly feared. Because Elijah Lewis wasn't just a successful attorney. He was the man who had dismantled 3 hospitals, 2 private universities, and a real estate empire over racial discrimination lawsuits in the past decade. And now he was here. For his wife. He moved with the unhurried stride of a man accustomed to rooms bending around him, shoulders squared beneath a tailored suit, his eyes sharp as obsidian, cutting through the false pleasantries and brittle smiles of those who instinctively recognized a reckoning incarnate. Janine Carter, still outside after stepping from her sedan, caught up to him, camera phone in hand. "How bad is it?" she asked under her breath. Elijah's jaw clenched. "Bad enough that it's about to be unforgettable." She gave a quick nod and fell in behind him. Inside, the air was too cool, the scent of antiseptic sharp and thin. The receptionist, Paige, forced a brittle cheerfulness into her voice. "Good morning, Mr. Lewis." "Spare it," Elijah replied without breaking stride. "Sir, I'm going to need you to—" "You're going to need to get your administrator," Elijah said, already pushing past the desk toward the elevators. "And you're going to do it before this escalates beyond your capacity to fix." Paige fumbled for the phone, her voice tight with unease. "Security." A nurse in pale blue scrubs nearby touched Paige's wrist. "Don't," she said quietly. "He's right." Elijah reached the elevator bay just as Amara stepped in from the courtyard. She walked toward him, her shoulders held square, though exhaustion dragged at the corners of her mouth. The smear of injustice clung to her like a second skin, but her gaze was clear. Elijah reached for her hand, squeezed it. "I've got this." Amara exhaled, a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "I know." They rode the elevator in silence, Amara leaning against him, her head momentarily resting against his shoulder. Elijah's phone buzzed, a text from one of his senior investigators. Confirmation. Randall's been flagged before. At least 3 informal complaints. Buried. "I'm digging deeper." Elijah's mouth tightened. As the elevator opened on the executive floor, Nathan Hawthorne waited there with 2 staffers, his face the color of bleached bone. He took one look at the tall man with the calm, deadly expression beside the visibly pregnant woman, and knew this was a crisis no amount of committee meetings or corporate jargon would neutralize. "Mr. Lewis, please come this way. We can sit down, discuss this like professionals." "I'm not here for a discussion," Elijah said evenly. "I'm here to clean house." They moved to the same glass-walled conference room that had hosted Randall's sneer and bile just minutes earlier. The sight of Elijah and Amara stepping into that room side by side was not lost on the staff scattered throughout the hallways. Conversations died. Screensaver images on computer monitors reflected the faces of those watching history quietly being made. "Dr. Randall is being paged," Hawthorne mumbled. "You'll get one chance," Elijah said, his voice so quiet it made Hawthorne's skin crawl. "To do the right thing. One." Amara sat with the quiet dignity of a woman long accustomed to carrying the weight of other people's assumptions. Elijah remained standing. The minutes passed. Randall arrived, arrogance still clinging to him, though now a shade dimmer. He scoffed, tried to wield his usual weapons: bluster, denial, the tired invocation of medical authority. It was then that Elijah, without raising his voice, began to dismantle him. "Do you know how many women like my wife have come through this hospital and left worse for the experience? How many you've humiliated, endangered, erased?" Randall opened his mouth to protest. Elijah placed a folder onto the table. Inside were printouts of patient records, informal HR complaints, staff notes with coded language, non-compliant patient, aggressive when asking questions, frequent requests for second opinions. Dozens of black and brown women. "Your pattern," Elijah said, "documented, verifiable, and about to be very, very public." Randall paled. Hawthorne visibly sagged in his seat. At precisely that moment, Vernon Tate and his board members arrived. The room filled, the weight of institutional power shifting with their entrance. But Elijah wasn't done. "Let's be clear," he said, turning to Tate. "You don't get to fix this with an internal memo. You don't get to move this man to another facility with a quiet retirement package. This ends. Today. Publicly." Tate's face was grim, but even he knew what side of this reckoning he'd rather be remembered on. Then, with deliberate, flawless timing, Janine Carter appeared in the open doorway, phone raised, its camera light on. "Elijah Lewis," she announced. "Would you care to make a statement for the public record?" And that was it. The death knell of silence. In that moment, every barrier that had protected Randall, every layer of institutional complicity, cracked. A reckoning long overdue had arrived in the flesh, and there was no putting it back into the shadows. Elijah turned, one hand resting protectively on Amara's shoulder. "Yes," he said, voice steady, eyes sharp. "I would." The glass walls of the conference room made the confrontation inside visible to the world outside. A deliberate architecture of supposed transparency, now weaponized against those who had for years depended on closed doors and hushed conversations to survive scandal. Every nurse at the reception desk, every technician pretending to check patient files, every administrative assistant shuffling papers with unnecessary importance. They all watched. And in the center of that public stage stood Elijah Lewis, calm, resolute, and prepared to dismantle a man and a system with words sharp enough to draw blood. "Let's start with what you said to my wife, Doctor." "Randall," Elijah began, his voice steady, every syllable sharpened by years of practice in courtrooms and boardrooms. I don't recall," Randall stammered, his smug facade cracking. "You don't recall referring to my unborn child as one of those big babies?" Elijah pressed. "You don't recall threatening to refuse care? You don't recall implying my wife was lying about her marriage or our child's paternity?" The room tensed. Morton, the hospital director, wiped sweat from his brow. Hawthorne stared at the table. Tate, the chairman, folded his arms. Elijah slid Amara's phone onto the table. The screen displayed an audio recording already cued at the precise timestamp. Without a word, Elijah tapped play. Randall's voice spilled into the room. "You people always have big babies. Don't make a scene now, sweetheart." A single beat of silence followed. No one moved. No one spoke. Then Janine Carter, still standing at the glass doorway, lifted her phone higher, recording every second. "You know what this is, Randall?" Elijah asked softly. "It's the sound of a man signing his own professional death warrant." Randall's face went from red to ashen, his breathing shallow. "This is taken out of context." "There is no context that saves you," Tate said coldly, his voice hoarse with disgust. "None." Elijah didn't look away from Randall, his words now slower, heavier. "This isn't just about you. This is about every administrator in this room who knew, every nurse too afraid to report it, every manager who buried complaints because it was easier than risking bad press." He turned to Hawthorne, who was visibly trembling. 12 informal complaints, isn't that right?" Hawthorne stammered. I didn't have conclusive proof." "You didn't want proof," Elijah corrected. "You wanted silence." Another folder hit the table. Clara, the nurse with trembling hands, had slipped it to Elijah minutes earlier. Inside, unsigned incident reports, patient's notes flagged for review, even a reprimand Randall had received 4 years ago for inappropriate bedside manner, conveniently omitted from his permanent file. "Would you like to explain why those weren't escalated, Mr. Hawthorne?" The administrator looked like he might be sick. I was under orders." "From whom?" The room held its breath. Hawthorne hesitated. Then his eyes flicked to Morton. The director blanched. "You unbelievable coward," Morton muttered. "You authorized the suppression of those reports?" Tate demanded, rising from his chair. Morton raised both hands, sweat gleaming on his forehead. "Look, this is getting blown out of proportion." "No," Elijah snapped, his voice slicing through the room. "What's out of proportion is how long you let this man play God with the health and dignity of black women who came into this hospital seeking care." He turned to Tate. "I hope you understand that this isn't going away quietly." Tate's jaw tightened. "I do, and I intend to act accordingly." Before Morton could speak again, Tate addressed the room. "Effective immediately, Dr. Mitchell Randall is terminated. Nathan Hawthorne is suspended pending a full ethics investigation, and Director Morton, you will tender your resignation by end of day." Randall bolted from his seat. "You can't—" "I can," Tate interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. "And if you don't walk out that door right now, security will assist you." The door opened as if on cue, the same guard who earlier wouldn't meet Amara's eyes now stepping inside. Randall's bravado collapsed. He slunk out, his face twisted, a man finally stripped of the protections his privilege had long afforded. Elijah didn't look at him as he passed. Instead, he turned to Tate one last time. "You'll set up a public review board. Every complaint, every incident for the last 5 years reinvestigated, including Desiree Coleman's case." Tate nodded. "Consider it done. And the initiative for maternal care bias training we discussed. That starts next month." "It will." Elijah finally exhaled, the fury in his chest settling into something more dangerous. Clarity. "Then you might have a hospital worth saving." He took Amara's hand, guiding her up from her chair. She stood tall, beautiful, and fierce, even in exhaustion. As they made their way toward the exit, Janine caught Elijah's gaze. "You want a closing statement?" Elijah paused at the door, then spoke to the room beyond the glass walls, to the staff and patients who had watched it all. "Let this be a warning, not just to this place, but to every institution that believes it can dehumanize black women without consequence. We are not invisible. We are not expendable. And we will not be silent." He gestured toward Amara. "This is my wife. This is my family. And you will treat all of us, with dignity. Or you will lose everything you built on our backs." A hush fell over the clinic. Elijah nodded to Janine. "You can run that." Then, with Amara's hand in his, he walked out, and for the first time in its history, St. Charles Medical Pavilion fell silent, the weight of its sins heavy in the air it left behind. Outside the conference room, the hospital's corridors felt disjointed, as though the air itself had changed composition. Silence gripped every space where earlier there had been idle chatter and whispered gossip. Now, glances darted nervously from face to face, staff processing what they'd witnessed through the glass, struggling to make sense of how swiftly power could be inverted when the right voice, backed by proof, resolve, and fury, finally spoke. Elijah and Amara moved down the hallway together, not as defeated victims, but as victors emerging from battle. The weight of the confrontation pressed down on Amara's exhausted shoulders, but she wore it like a cloak, knowing she had survived what so many hadn't, and more importantly, she hadn't endured it in silence. What neither of them realized yet was how deep the infection ran. Behind them, Vernon Tate's phone rang. He stepped into a side office to answer. "Yes," he barked. The voice on the other end, belonging to an internal compliance officer, was tense. "Mr. Tate, you need to see something. It's not just Randall, there's a pattern." Tate's stomach twisted. "How far back?" 5 years, at least. Within minutes, a secure file was transferred to Tate's tablet. He scrolled through it in grim disbelief. Patient complaints buried. Discrimination suits settled out of court under strict NDAs. Statistical disparities in maternal mortality rates at the clinic, with Black women twice as likely to suffer complications or be referred to other, lesser-equipped facilities. Notes by doctors with language like frequent complainer, difficult patient, and worse. And it wasn't just Randall. 3 other physicians, 2 nurse managers, administrative staff complicit in falsifying patient records to minimize liability. It was an ecosystem. Tate's throat tightened. Not because he was surprised, he wasn't naive, but because he understood what it meant when such a thing was documented. It meant ruin, federal probes, media hellstorms, lawsuits that would stretch for years. And somehow, Elijah Lewis had known where to aim, because behind Elijah's righteous anger wasn't just a wounded husband. It was a man who had been watching for years, waiting for the right moment to peel the scab from a system that festered behind white coats and marble lobbies. In another office, the nurse Clara stood by the break room window, her hands trembling as she clutched her phone. She had never spoken up before. She had seen other women like Amara, Desiree Coleman, and a woman named Tasha Brewer, who died from undiagnosed eclampsia after Randall ignored her symptoms. Clara's own report had been misplaced after she tried to flag the incident. Now, for the first time, Clara allowed herself to hope that maybe this time it wouldn't get buried. In the clinic's digital records department, an IT technician named Marcus quietly copied key patient records to a secure drive. He'd overheard too many off-color jokes in staff meetings, seen too many late-night data purges. But after seeing Elijah Lewis and hearing his wife's voice on that recording, something inside Marcus shifted. He texted a burner number he'd saved months ago, one linked to a pro bono civil rights law firm. "It's happening. I have proof." Within minutes, he received a response. "Deliver tonight, full immunity guaranteed." It wasn't just about Randall anymore. It was about all of them. Across town, Janine Carter sat in the passenger seat of her assistant's car, reviewing footage from the confrontation. Every word was crisp, every expression damning. The story was already writing itself in her head, not just about one doctor's misconduct, but about a culture of erasure. She texted Elijah, "Found the pattern. You're going to want to see this." The reply came back fast. "Send it through. Don't hold anything back." And Janine wouldn't. Because Elijah Lewis didn't fight for headlines. He fought to break systems. Back at the pavilion, Tate called a boardroom emergency session. 6 executives dialed in via video, their faces pale and drawn. "This is bigger than Randall," Tate said grimly. "It's systemic." "What's the exposure?" one executive asked. "Total. Lewis has a case, and Carter has the story." One woman on the board whispered, "We'll lose accreditation." Tate rubbed his forehead. We'll lose more than that. At the same time, Amara and Elijah walked past a nurse station, and for the first time, one of the staff, an older black nurse named Yvonne, stepped forward. "Mrs. Lewis," she murmured. Amara turned. "I'm sorry," Yvonne said, her voice shaking. "I should have spoken up sooner." Amara swallowed the tightness in her throat. She touched the woman's hand. "You don't owe me an apology. You owed yourself a choice, and you made it now. That matters." Tears pricked at Yvonne's eyes. As Amara and Elijah reached the entrance, the entire lobby watched them go. Not one insult, not one side-eye glance, no longer dismissed or underestimated, because this wasn't just about a pregnant black woman anymore. It was about all of them, and for the first time in that hospital's history, everyone understood it. As they stepped into the sun-drenched courtyard, Elijah checked his phone. Another message from his investigator. "Mortality stats confirmed. Worse than we thought. Sending files to DOJ contacts now." Elijah's jaw clenched. "It's systemic," he said aloud. Amara met his gaze, understanding instantly. "So we burn it down," she murmured. He smiled for the first time that day. Not a gentle smile, a fierce one. Every brick, the executive boardroom of St. Charles Medical Pavilion had always been a sanctuary of power. Its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline, its long mahogany table gleaming under the soft wash of recessed lighting. For decades, it had been a place where decisions were made without witnesses, where lawsuits were settled quietly, and inconvenient complaints were crushed under legalese and influence. But today, it felt like a trap closing in on itself. Vernon Tate stood at the head of the table, his face drawn, the lines around his eyes deeper than they'd looked hours earlier. Around him, 6 members of the hospital's board joined via video call on a wall of monitors. Their faces, usually polished and indifferent, now flickered with barely contained panic. Elijah Lewis's legal notice had detonated like a grenade in the center of their carefully maintained order, and the evidence Janine Carter had delivered, now streaming discreetly on a secured laptop in front of Tate, made one thing brutally clear. There was no salvaging this with polite statements or token suspensions. Not this time. "I've just reviewed the full report," Tate began, his voice grim. "And let me be absolutely clear. What's been uncovered in the last 90 minutes isn't a personnel problem. It's a cultural one. This hospital has fostered and protected patterns of discrimination, negligence, and medical bias for years." The room was silent. One of the board members, a graying man in a navy suit, cleared his throat. "Vernon, what's the liability?" Tate tapped the tablet in front of him, pulling up projected figures. "Assuming we settle with the Lewis family, which, by the way, isn't even the largest risk here, and assuming no federal investigation follows, our exposure is already in the high 7 figures. If the DOJ takes this up, which they will, we're looking at full loss of public funding, revocation of license, and criminal negligence suits." A blonde woman in the corner square of the video call shook her head, aghast. "All over one doctor?" Tate snapped his gaze to her. "Did you not hear a word I said? It's not just Randall. It's the policies you signed off on, the HR directives to limit Medicaid intakes, the quiet redirection of certain patients to overburdened city clinics, the NDAs, the buried maternal mortality reports." Another voice spoke up, weary. "What does Lewis want?" At that, Tate paused, because he knew Elijah hadn't just come for Randall's head, and not for a settlement. No, Elijah's fight was always larger than one man. He'd spent years dismantling the frameworks of discrimination that existed behind polite institutional facades. Tate understood instinctively that Elijah wanted something more dangerous than money. He wanted structural change. "He submitted a list of demands," Tate said quietly, "and I suggest we meet every single one." He tapped the screen and read them aloud. 1. Immediate termination of Dr. Mitchell Randall, with public acknowledgement of misconduct. 2. Full public apology to Mrs. Amara Lewis and all patients harmed by discriminatory practices. 3. Establishment of the Desiree Coleman Initiative, a permanent independent board for maternal health care equity. 4. External audit of all patient outcomes, admissions, and care practices from the past 10 years. 5. Mandatory anti-bias medical training for all staff, monitored by independent civil rights groups. 6. Creation of a public compensation fund for families of patients adversely affected by negligence. 7. Ongoing partnership with Black maternal health advocacy organizations, with quarterly public reporting. One of the younger board members blanched. He wants to burn us down. No, Tate corrected, looking toward the door Elijah Lewis had walked out of just minutes earlier. He wants to rebuild us from the ashes, and if we have any sense left, we'll let him. There was silence again, but this time it wasn't uncertainty. It was recognition. Because even those who still clung to their excuses understood that the court of public opinion had already reached a verdict. Janine Carter's story was scheduled to air within the hour, and social media was ablaze with screenshots and recordings from inside the hospital lobby. The phrase, "You people always have big babies," was already trending. "I move we accept the demands in full," Tate said. No one argued. One by one, virtual hands were raised on the screen. Unanimous. Tate exhaled and reached for his phone. He dialed Elijah directly. It rang once. "Speak," Elijah's voice answered. "It's done," Tate said. "All of it. Randall's out, Morton's gone, Hawthorne's suspended. The initiative's approved, and the audit begins tomorrow." Elijah didn't gloat, he didn't thank him. "I want it in writing," Elijah said, his tone flat. "You'll have it within the hour." A pause. Then Elijah added, "I expect to see a statement on every major outlet by sunset." Tate's throat tightened. Understood. The call ended. Across the table, one of the board members whispered, "This place will never be the same." Tate looked toward the glass walls where a group of nurses, including Clara and Yvonne, gathered to watch, and for the first time in years, he didn't see fear or silence in their eyes. "I hope not," Tate murmured, because it was long past time. Mitchell Randall had spent the better part of 20 years at St. Charles Medical Pavilion, moving through its corridors with the effortless entitlement of a man convinced of his invincibility. His name on brass plaques, his portrait in the donor hallway. The kind of doctor whose racist remarks were called old school, whose callousness toward black patients was brushed off as bluntness. His decades of immunity were a shield forged not just by his own arrogance, but by the cowardice of those around him. And in less than 2 hours, it was all gone. Word spread fast. By the time Randall made it to the employee parking garage, security on either side, the hospital's internal messaging boards were flooded. Screenshots of Elijah Lewis's speech, the audio clip of Randall's voice, Janine Carter's live stream, staff text threads titled, "It's Happening," and "Justice Errors Saint." Charles. But none of that reached Randall as he stormed toward his car, fury contorting his face. "This is a witch hunt," he spat to the guards. "They'll beg me to come back in a month." The older of the two men didn't answer. He knew better than to speak. When Randall reached his luxury sedan and swung the door open, a familiar voice stopped him. "You forgot something, Doc." He turned. Clara, the nurse, stood near the passenger side. In her hand, she held a manila folder. It was Randall's pending patient reports, the ones he'd never get to sign. He sneered. "Get out of my way, girl." Clara's hand didn't shake. "You don't get to call me that anymore." And with that, she dropped the folder into a trash bin nearby and walked away. Randall sputtered, but there was no one left to hear his protest. The last of his audience had dispersed. Within minutes, his hospital credentials were deactivated, his email account locked. His access card denied at every reader in the building. His name was scrubbed from the medical schedule by sunset, but it wasn't just his job that was falling apart. Janine's exposé, released that afternoon on the Sentinel's website and social feeds, ignited a wildfire. The headline was brutal. A System of Silence: How St. Charles Medical Pavilion Failed Black Mothers. The subheading named Randall outright, and under it, a quote from Elijah Lewis: "We are not expendable. And we will not be silent." Within an hour, the story had trended in multiple cities. Black maternal health advocates reposted it. Civil rights groups demanded criminal investigations. The state medical board opened an emergency review. And by evening, the district attorney's office issued a statement confirming their interest in pursuing charges related to medical negligence and civil rights violations. For the first time, the man who had smirked in Amara's face, who had threatened countless women with his weaponized indifference, faced real, tangible consequences. Randall's past patients came forward. Women who had been dismissed. Babies who hadn't made it. Names long buried in HR archives, and it didn't stop there. The hospital's board, desperate to salvage credibility, released its own statement. A public, televised apology delivered by Vernon Tate himself to Mrs. Amara Lewis, her family, and every patient harmed by the failings of this institution. "We offer our deepest apologies," Tate read, his voice heavy. "We acknowledge the systemic racism embedded within our practices and pledge to dismantle it fully." Behind him, a new plaque was unveiled, the Desiree Coleman Initiative for Maternal Care Equity, in bold, unmissable letters. Amara watched the broadcast from her living room, her hand resting on her belly. Elijah sat beside her, a glass of water in his hand. Neither spoke as the camera panned over the hospital staff gathered for the announcement. They saw Yvonne standing tall, Clara beside her. Nurses of every background, faces Amara had glimpsed in those sterile halls now bearing something new: resolve. When Tate finished, Janine Carter took the mic. "This isn't the end," Janine said, looking directly into the camera. "It's the beginning." Because one family refused to be silent, and because injustice can't survive the daylight, applause broke out on the hospital lawn. In that moment, Mitchell Randall sat alone in his darkened living room, the television casting a cold light on his face as his phone rang again and again. Calls from lawyers, former colleagues, media outlets. He didn't answer. The world had moved on without him, and it would no longer shield men like him. The untouchable had fallen. Not with a quiet resignation or a backroom deal, but publicly, completely, irreversibly. And the system that had protected him cracked wide open with him. Later that evening, when Elijah's phone buzzed with confirmation from the DOJ's Civil Rights Division, an inquiry was officially underway, he glanced at Amara. "It's happening," he murmured. She reached for his hand. "I told you," she said, her voice soft but unshaken. "We don't bend anymore." And they didn't. The man who had called their child a statistic was gone, but the fight, the one for every other mother, every other family, had only just begun. The morning after the public reckoning at St. Charles Medical Pavilion, the air around the hospital felt entirely different. Gone was the stale hum of quiet complicity, the brittle hierarchy that dictated who belonged and who merely survived within its walls. In its place lingered a tentative, unfamiliar current of accountability. The hospital's towering glass facade caught the first light of dawn, and for the first time in years, people entered not in fear or indifference, but with a sense that change, real, structural, unapologetic change, had finally breached the gates. Amara Lewis arrived through those front doors, not as a patient this time, but as a woman stepping into the heart of an institution she helped dismantle. She wore a simple, elegant wrap dress, her locks cascading down her back. The child inside her stirred gently, as if sensing the charge in the atmosphere. Beside her walked Elijah, shoulders squared, his gaze sharp as ever. A cluster of reporters waited outside the entrance, though they kept their distance. The story had reached national outlets overnight. The New York Times, CNN, and The Root ran segments naming St. Charles as ground zero for a long overdue reckoning on racial bias in maternal health care. Inside the lobby, banners hung announcing the launch of the Desiree Coleman Initiative for Maternal Care Equity. Large monitors displayed a message from Vernon Tate, carefully worded but unequivocal. To the women we failed, we see you now, we hear you, and we are changing. It was no absolution, it wasn't meant to be. In one of the newly designated boardrooms, a gathering of staff, medical personnel, and community leaders waited. Many faces were new: civil rights attorneys, maternal health advocates, midwives from underserved communities. Others were familiar: Yvonne, Clara, Marcus the IT tech, each of them carrying the visible strain of those harrowing hours, but tempered by a kind of resilient pride. Elijah stepped to the front. The hush that settled over the room wasn't out of fear, but expectation. "This isn't a press stunt," Elijah began, his voice steady. "This isn't about branding or optics or shielding this institution from the consequences it earned. This is about rebuilding a place where every patient, every mother, every family is protected, where silence won't be bought, and where the names we lost, like Desiree Coleman, like Tasha Brewer, are remembered not as numbers but as lives stolen too soon." Applause rose, genuine and fierce. Amara stepped forward next, a slight shake in her hands, not from nerves but from the gravity of what she was about to accept. "I wasn't here for this role," she said quietly, "but I'm here now. I've agreed to serve as chair of the new Patient Advocacy Council. Not because it's easy, not because it'll erase what happened to me or to the women before me, but because this space belongs to us now. And if we don't claim it, they'll fill it with the same systems that failed us." Heads nodded around the room. Yvonne's eyes brimmed. Elijah watched her speak, his heart pounding with something heavier than pride. It was reverence. Tate, standing to the side, cleared his throat. "The board has allocated immediate funding for an independent audit of every maternal care file from the last 10 years, he announced. "We'll work with DOJ liaisons and with the Desiree Coleman Initiative's legal team. Full transparency. No exceptions." Clara raised her hand. "And the staff complicit in covering up complaints?" Tate met her gaze. "Will be dealt with accordingly. Their tenure here is over." The statement was met with fierce, weary applause. Janine Carter arrived halfway through the session, her phone still buzzing with interview requests from national anchors. She waved them off and crossed the room to Elijah. "Already reaching other hospitals," she murmured. "Mothers calling out similar stories at Westbridge Mercy General. This blew the door off." Elijah's expression tightened. Good. That was the point. Later, as the formal meeting gave way to informal circles of conversation, Amara moved through the room, speaking with younger nurses, doulas, community health workers. A teenage girl, no older than 16, approached her quietly, her hands fidgeting with a hospital volunteer badge. "My sister. She died here 2 years ago," the girl said. "They said it was her fault. She was too young, too poor, too—" She hesitated. Amara reached for the girl's hand. "Too black." The girl nodded. Amara squeezed her fingers. Not anymore. It was a vow, one Amara had no intention of breaking. As the sun climbed higher and the day wore on, new protocols were drafted. Hiring freezes were issued for departments pending ethics reviews. Anti-bias training dates were locked in. Medical advocacy partnerships signed. And in an unprecedented move, the board voted to offer reparative payments to families of those harmed by the hospital's past negligence, without requiring NDAs. Elijah looked over the documents that afternoon and allowed himself one brief, sharp smile. This, he thought, was what power looked like when wielded to uplift, not suppress. As he stood beside Amara on the hospital steps hours later, watching new banners raised, he whispered, "You did this." Amara shook her head, her hand resting on her belly. "We did." And behind them, St. Charles Medical Pavilion began to look, for the first time, like a place worthy of its name. The days that followed the upheaval at St. Charles Medical Pavilion rippled far beyond its gleaming glass walls. What began as one woman's brutal, humiliating encounter and a husband's unflinching demand for justice had in less than a week ignited a national reckoning. By Wednesday, maternal health advocacy groups from Chicago to Atlanta had organized vigils and forums, holding up photos of women who never left hospital beds alive, their names spoken aloud over candlelight. Hashtags carrying Desiree Coleman's name surged on social media. Journalists unearthed similar negligence patterns in hospitals across the country, their investigations revealing what Black mothers had always known, that they were less believed, less cared for, and more likely to die in childbirth than anyone else. But now no one could pretend ignorance. Elijah Lewis received a direct call from the Office for Civil Rights. An inquiry was underway, not just into St. Charles, but into systemic practices in hospitals statewide. The agent's voice was tense but grateful. Your work opened a door we've been trying to breach for years. At the same time, the Desiree Coleman initiative gained unprecedented support. Within 72 hours, 5 major hospitals announced plans to implement similar equity boards, and maternal mortality data, long obscured behind institutional walls, was being demanded by communities. On national television, Janine Carter led panel discussions with mothers, doulas, and activists. She didn't allow hospital executives to spin statements or dodge accountability. She sat across from them with receipts, audio clips, and unflinching questions. One night, Elijah and Amara watched her special from their living room. The footage cut between Elijah's confrontation with Randall and interviews with mothers holding framed photographs of daughters and sisters lost to negligence. Amara's hand rested on her belly, the baby shifting with quiet insistence. Her due date was close now. "We changed it," she murmured. "No," Elijah corrected gently, his arm around her shoulder. "You changed it." She leaned into him, eyes glinting in the dim light of their home. "I didn't do it alone." The truth was, they hadn't. It took Clara's courage to step forward. It took Marcus pulling patient files in the dark. It took Yvonne risking her career, and Vernon Tate cracking under the unbearable weight of complicity. It took the anonymous mothers who flooded hotlines with their stories. It took journalists refusing to let the outrage pass like a trending topic. And it would take more, because this wasn't the kind of war won in 1 week. The systems weren't gone, the biases didn't vanish. But now the fight was visible, and the silence, the most dangerous weapon of all, had been broken. At the clinic's entrance days later, a new plaque gleamed beneath a dogwood tree. "In honor of Desiree Coleman and every woman silenced we remember. We change." Amara returned for one final appointment before transferring to the midwife-led birthing center she and Elijah had chosen. The hospital felt different. Nurses greeted her with genuine warmth. Yvonne led her to a room, not because she had to, but because she asked to. The walls still bore the same neutral paint. The smell of antiseptic remained. But the air was different now, tinged with accountability, with consequence. Before she left, Clara caught up with her. "I meant to tell you this, we're naming the new maternal wing after Desiree. It was Yvonne's idea." Amara's throat tightened. She nodded. "That matters." It mattered because names were memory, and memory forced institutions to confront the people their systems erased. The night Amara finally went into labor, Elijah drove her not to St. Charles, but to the community-run birthing center. The midwives there knew her story. They called her by name. They let her labor in water, her mother and Elijah nearby, her music filling the room. At 3:42 a.m., she gave birth to a healthy baby girl. They named her Nia. It meant purpose. And in the quiet dawn hours, when Amara held her daughter against her skin, she thought of Desiree, of every woman whose name she didn't know, of the ones who fought and the ones who didn't survive. And she whispered a vow against Nia's soft hair. "You'll never inherit their silence." I swear it. Weeks later, when national legislation was proposed to mandate maternal mortality reporting and require bias training in hospitals nationwide, Elijah and Amara were invited to stand behind the podium as it was announced, not for appearances, but because this fight began with them, and because justice doesn't arrive all at once. It comes in ripples, in broken silences, in hands held tight in hospital corridors, and sometimes in the clear-eyed gaze of a newborn named Nia.